Exercise your rights. Exercise your rights to vote. Know your rights. Exercise your rights to vote. Know your rights. Exercise your rights to vote. Know your rights. Know your rights.
We're marching today to dramatize to the world that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens denied the right to vote.
We will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
I have power represented here today, and I come to ask you to go all out to get every Negro in this county registered to vote. If each of you assembled here today decided that you were going to see that 10 other people are registered before the last day, which I think is next weekend, the 14th, I believe, just see what a power you can be. And then after getting people registered, that is another and even greater responsibility, and that is to go out to vote in the primary.
Good morning to all attendees of the 7th Annual CDU President's Breakfast. Please welcome Sylvia Drew Ivey, Senior Special Assistant to the President and CEO for Community Affairs, and the platinum sponsor of today's event. She will provide opening remarks and introduce today's host, CDU President and CEO, Dr. David M. Carlisle.
Good morning, and welcome. CDU, faculty, staff, community of supporters of the mission and vision of the Charles R. Drew University. We're gathered today to talk about an extremely important issue with a host of wonderful participants in implementing our democracy in this country. We want to hear from them. We want to learn from them. We want to galvanize our energies to meet the challenge that we meet today in trying to obstruct our right to vote and direct what goes on in this country at the state and national and local level. At every level of government, our vote could not be more important. Martin Luther King struggled across that bridge in Selma in 1965 to get the consciousness of the nation aroused so that we could pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We got it passed. Lyndon Johnson's bill, we got it passed. And it said we have to watch people. We can't just say you have the right to vote. We have to set up a system to watch people. And now our Supreme Court is trying to take that watching provision away. So we're going to talk about this today. Dr. Carlisle is leading our discussion. I want to take a minute, if you'll allow me, to introduce Dr. Carlisle. I'm sure you know him as the president of Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, where he's been at the helm for 11 years, meeting a variety of great challenges with aplomb and success. He brings a wonderful background of publication in health policy, quality of care, medical education diversity, and elimination of health disparities. He's a board-certified specialist in internal medicine. His clinical work has always revolved around care for the underserved. He's a graduate of Wesleyan. He majored in chemistry and earned his medical degree from Brown University, his master in public health, and his PhD in health services research from UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He completed a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program Fellowship at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA in 1990. He joins us today as the host. This is our 7th annual CDU President's Breakfast. Dr. Carlisle?
Well, good morning, Sylvia, and thank you very much for that most kind introduction and your opening remarks. And good morning to our entire audience. I am indeed Dr. David Carlisle, President and CEO of Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. I extend a most sincere welcome to all the attendees and participants for the 7th annual President's Breakfast. Thank you to our speakers and panelists, to our sponsors and guests, and to everyone in our CDU community, including our Board of Trustees, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and of course, friends and supporters, and certainly our sponsors. The President's Breakfast has been an annual opportunity for leaders in the health, education, social justice, business, and philanthropic sectors to gather to discuss topics of great import. This year's edition, Voting Rights and Redistricting, What's at Stake, is no different. I would argue that this topic is both timely and essential, that there is so much on the line in our society that every important change we need to see starts with an election. It's how democracy is supposed to work. However, the state of our nation's electoral process raises many questions. Is redistricting a tool or a threat? Can you out-organize voter suppression? And what happens when instead of the voters choosing their representatives, the representatives choose their voters? We will spend most of the next hour or more delving into these important questions. First, in a conversation with our featured speaker, and then with the wonderful panel we have joining us today. For now, let me start by overviewing the topic a little bit. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson, as you heard Sylvia Drew-Ivy say. It aimed to increase the number of registered voters in areas where there were records of previous discrimination. It outlawed literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting, while also prohibiting these jurisdictions from creating new voting practices or procedures without pre-clearance from the federal government. Proportional representation became required through the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution's 14th Amendment in 1868. In this electoral system, for example, in a 5-seat district with proportional representation, if Party A received 40% of the vote and Party B received 60% of the vote, Party A would win 2 seats and Party B would win 3 seats. It seems simple and fair until you start tinkering with the district. So we're now looking at a sample of a town, 50 people living in a town, 30 of them, or 60%, voting blue. The remaining 20 voters that make up the 40% of the town tend to vote red. When looking to apportion this town into 5 districts, a truly proportional approach would create 3 red and 2 blue districts, representing the relative composition of the town as shown in the first districting. However, a simple reorienting of the districting strategy, as shown in the second example, would completely suppress the power of red voters by making them a minority in every district. On the flip side, a more creative approach to drawing these lines would significantly dilute the influence of the majority party to a minority position. You might think that drawing lines like those in the third example are fine from abstract demonstration, but simply wouldn't fly in real life, right? Well, this is Metro Chicago's 4th district. The left shows it superimposed over a regular map. It looks suspicious. I mean, that strip holding the district together in the middle is actually a long patch of grass running down a divided highway with no homes on it. However, when we superimpose Chicago metro area's Hispanic and Latino population from the census data, as we do on the right, we get a different story. The boundaries of this district were drawn in 1991 with the goal of giving these communities a common electoral voice as mandated by the Voting Rights Act. Every small impact from voter suppression and redistricting risks being the straw that breaks the camel's back. The 3 states that have become particularly aggressive in restrictive voting policies are Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. In these 3 states, President Biden's combined margin of victory was less than 43,000 votes across all 3 states. That's the margin that kept Donald Trump from being president right now as I speak and allowed Joseph Biden to win the election. And it's too soon to know what this means for our next election. Who we send to Washington or the state, city, or local legislators has a huge impact on everything, including healthcare, education, and our economy in ways that can change the fate of minorities and suppress entire segments of our society for generations. It also influences policies that shape other aspects of our lives, such as policing, a topic that is very close to the heart of our featured guest today, whom we are very honored to have with us. Shaun King, American author and civil rights activist, was recently hailed by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential people in the world on the internet. Author of Make Change, How to Fight Injustice, Dismantle Systemic Oppression, and Our Own Future, Shaun's strength is in how he rallies and unites people of disparate backgrounds, becoming one of the most renowned American activists in the process. As a writer, he has written an astounding 1,500 articles on injustice since 2014 and gives morning commentary on the legendary Tom Joyner Morning Show, heard by 6 million listeners in over 100 cities. Founder and CEO of the North Star, a digital version of abolitionist Frederick Douglass's iconic journal, King uses his platforms and passion to unearth the truth and to organize in purposeful and directed ways. He's here for a special one-on-one conversation with me today, and then will join us on our panel later in the event. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Mr. Shaun King. Shaun, thank you for joining us today.
It's my honor. Yeah, good to see you. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Okay, it's an honor to have you with us, and we're highly pleased to have you join us, and looking forward to our discussion. Well, let's start at the beginning. So here's a question for you. When did you make the decision to commit to questing for social justice, and what pushed you in that direction?
That's a great question. I actually grew up. I'm in Brooklyn, New York right now, but I grew up in rural Kentucky, and my friends and I was born in 1979, so I was born 10 years really after the assassination of Dr. King, but we still faced so much bigotry and racism and discrimination in the small town that I grew up in Kentucky. And in a lot of ways, we found ourselves just as students in middle school and high school fighting for our own dignity, fighting against racism and bigotry that we experienced on a daily basis. And so I think had I not experienced firsthand so much discrimination from not just racist students, but even administrators and others growing up in Kentucky, I don't know that I would have ultimately ended up on the path that I was on. I don't mean to say that I wouldn't have chosen to fight for civil rights and human rights the way I'm doing now, but like so many other people that came before me, in a lot of ways, it was kind of forced on me to fight for myself and those around me. And so by the time I left Kentucky to go to Morehouse College, I'd already been for the previous few years kind of just fighting for my own survival. And it was though when I got to Morehouse that I started being able to kind of ground my lived experience in a history and a struggle and a tradition that I really didn't know much about before I got to Morehouse. And so Morehouse ended up being kind of like an incubator and a hospital for me and brothers who got there from all over the country and around the world. We got there with all of our own challenges and issues, but then suddenly became a part of just a beautiful tradition of fighting for civil rights and human rights. And so uh, I think when I got to Morehouse in 1997 was when I really made up in my mind that being an active leader for civil rights and human rights was going to be just a part of the rest of my life. And just to close the loop on that, it was in my freshman and sophomore year that we saw two incidents that are not dissimilar from what my own children have now experienced. There was a young black man named James Byrd who was brutally lynched in Jasper, Texas, when I was a sophomore. Not unlike what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, who was also targeted and lynched himself. And then I became student government president, and while I was student government president at Morehouse, a young brother named Amadou Diallo was shot and killed, shot 41 times by the NYPD. And those two moments catalyzed me and a lot of my peers, just like the murder of Ahmaud Arbery or the shooting death of Breonna Taylor or the murder of George Floyd, have done for young people of this generation, including my own kids. And so that's not dissimilar from what the murder and lynching of Emmett Till did in the 1950s, and how it catalyzed the generations that came before me and crystallized like just the extreme nature of bigotry and racism in this country.
Well, thank you, Shaun, for invoking those names. You know, these and so many others are names on the pantheon of injustice in the history of this country. All individuals who have lost their lives through acts of violence motivated by racial origins, discrimination, prejudice, and again, racism. Let's comment on that a little bit. I appreciate you're talking about your experience at Morehouse, and like many other HBCUs, that's such a determinative experience for young people today, and we certainly know that. But let's talk about your upbringing a little bit more. You mentioned that you grew up in the South Kentucky and have seen racism in many forms. Do you think that progress has been made in the last decade, maybe specifically Kentucky, but around the country? And what does the next decade look like to you?
Those are great questions. And I think I would have to answer that with kind of a yes and no. In a lot of ways, I talk about this in the first few, I have a book called Make Change, and in the first few chapters, I talk about kind of the cyclical nature of history and how we like to think of history as like this steady trajectory where things are getting better and better and better and better. And while there are some things that are better, not just in the South, but in this country, it depends on what you're measuring it by. And so if our measurement was mass incarceration, well, what we know is there are millions more people incarcerated in 2022 than were incarcerated in 1952. And so if we were comparing 2022 to 1952, the results would be disastrous. And so if that was the measurement, things would be worse. If our measurement was how many people are killed per year by police, most studies seem to suggest that the number of people killed per year by police in 1962 was somewhere between 100 and 150 people per year. Well, last year was 1,200. And so it just depends on what we're measuring. And so there are no doubt amazing victories that are historic. There are breakthroughs with voting rights and civil rights. but it depends on what we're measuring. If we're talking about Black home ownership, if we're talking about the stability of the Black household. And so we have to say, yes, there are victories that we fought for and won. And we have to say, how did we win those victories? How did we create the plans? How did we out organize? It was a phrase I heard you use earlier that I love. How did we out organize those who were fighting against us in the past? But how do we now duplicate that in the future? And so some things I think are significantly better, and then some things are painfully worse. And we just have to constantly ask ourselves what our metrics are, and how do we measure the progress that we're fighting for. And if we're not constantly reevaluating those metrics, we can sometimes assume that we're better off than we actually are, you know?
Well, as a researcher, using empiric methods, your term metrics has a definite appeal to me, and you're absolutely right. The method of measurement is determined by the metric used. Right. I wanted to come back to a number that you said, 1,200 deaths. Do you want to repeat that? Because I want to contrast it with the number 9.
Yeah, you know, the Washington Post, it took them a while because in 2015 and 2016, and they had a project that won the Pulitzer Prize for measuring police violence in America and documenting it, measuring it. And their project, in part because some of the staff that oversaw that project left, that project really fell off. And instead of it being something that they accurately measured daily, it took them a few months into 2022 to release the most updated data for 2021, which determined that 2021 was actually the deadliest year of police violence ever measured. And that came after, you know, not just protests and marches and demonstrations, but more attention on the issue of police violence than we've probably ever had in our lifetime. So the year after all of that attention ultimately ended up being the most deadly year of police violence ever measured. And so we have to constantly get back to that measurement to say, are we getting better, and how do we measure it? And at least in that one singular issue of police violence, no, we're not getting better. Not in Los Angeles, not in California, not in the country. Even if it feels that way, we have to sometimes juxtapose our feelings versus the data to say, are we safe or aren't we? And what measurements and metrics can validate or invalidate our feelings. And so I'm incredibly hopeful about our future, but I was deeply discouraged when I learned that 2021 was indeed a historic year for police violence. It is discouraging.
Yes, 1,200 lives versus the number 9 that has often been offered by conservative pundits in terms of the number of African Americans who've been killed in the hands of police during the past year. 2 orders of magnitude or more difference, basically, depending on one's political perspective, I would say, or ideological perspective. Let me ask again another question, Shaun. What do you believe was our nation's biggest missed opportunity to change direction or course to correct the issue of social and criminal justice or injustice? How do we avoid future wrong turns?
That's a great question, and it's something I think about so often. You know, before we started this program, there were several clips of Dr. King that were played, and there's a quote from Dr. King that Harry Belafonte lifted up, and he said that Dr. King told him that he was afraid he had integrated his people into a burning house. And as Dr. King started looking back on what he thought were some of the gains of the civil rights movement, he started reconsidering and saying, hey, have we won what I thought we won? Have we gained what I thought we gained? And I think, Dr. King, who was just 39 when he was killed, was at a really critical point where he was also starting to use metrics to say, are these victories doing what we intended them to do? And he never really got to fully live out the answers to those questions. And what we saw after the assassination of Dr. King, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, was this massive explosion, particularly there in California where you are, of mass incarceration. And we have not at all recovered from that. And I think if I had to summarize, like, what is the biggest mistake or loss centered there, this country, and when I say this country, I don't just mean our political enemies. I don't just mean people who vote differently than we do. This country as a whole, including African-American voters and leaders, and we were in a conversation earlier, and I encourage people to read the book Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr., a brilliant book that unpacks the role of the Democratic Party in building mass incarceration, the role of local Black leaders who were struggling to find out real solutions to public safety issues, ultimately helped build kind of this Frankenstein of mass incarceration. We continue in America to try to incarcerate ourselves out of our worst problems. And so we try to incarcerate ourselves out of problems of poverty. That doesn't work. We try to incarcerate ourselves out of issues of substance abuse. That doesn't work. We try to incarcerate ourselves out of issues of homelessness and mental illness. All of those issues do create very real public health challenges for Los Angeles, for California, for New York, for Manhattan, for Brooklyn, where I am now. All of those things are real, and they create public safety issues and public health issues. They do. But you will always fail if you try to incarcerate yourself out of any of those problems. The solutions have to be way more robust, way more comprehensive. And what saddens me is I see us in 2022 already duplicating so many problems that we saw in 1992 with the advent of kind of a new wave of criminal justice policy from not just the crime bill, but 3 strikes policies and others. And it's based, though, in a real concern about safety. I do a lot of work in Philadelphia, and last year was the deadliest year ever for murders in Philadelphia. That's not a conservative talking point. It's real and it's painful. I mean, we're talking about one of America's oldest cities. So for last year to be the deadliest year ever for Philadelphia for homicides, it's tearing apart families. It's ruining the lives of children. But even that issue is not one that you can simply incarcerate your way out of. And so we have to say, how do we address our deepest problems with robust, comprehensive solutions? But America always kind of defaults back to policing and incarceration. And that goes back, of course, to the founding of this country, and why we keep defaulting back to these kind of tired tropes that don't really solve our most difficult problems.
Well, here's another one for you, and thank you very much for that very illuminating perspective. And I totally agree. And full circle, this incarceration, when you bring it all the way back to our university and our role, becomes a healthcare issue.
Yep. And
the health of populations is impacted directly through mass incarceration and its resulting effects. Shaun, you have 1 million followers on Twitter and have been hailed by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential people in the world on the internet. What role can social media play in making a difference in voting rights and redistricting efforts? How can those of us with a few less than a million followers leverage technology to participate in this push?
Well, that list that I made, Donald Trump was also on that list. And so I say that to say you can use social media for good or evil. You can use it to influence people for powerful policy change, or you can influence it to scare your followers into their most kind of based instincts. And so social media at its root is just a platform to communicate with and influence people. And the challenge is, though, that the algorithms often really, um, really hinge on fear. And so you can scare people into a lot of different policies. And just as a quick illustration, I read an article yesterday in the New York Times that said the overwhelming majority of people who are fighting against critical race theory in public schools don't have children and don't have children in public schools. And it's because social media has been used to misinform them, to scare them, to frighten them into thinking that this is actually an issue that they need to care about desperately. Well, we have to ask ourselves, how effectively are we using these tools to inform people not only of the problems that we're up against, but to give people basic actions they can take to make a difference? Here's case in point. I spoke recently at another university, and there were maybe 400 students there, and it was a Zoom meeting, so I could see all of the students. And I asked the students, how many of you have been asked by the Democratic Party to take some kind of action to protect voting rights? I think 2 students raised their hand out of almost 500. So even though there were hundreds of students there who cared about voting rights, nobody had actually asked them to do anything about it. Not on Twitter, not on Instagram, not on TikTok, not on Facebook. There are a lot of missed opportunities there. And so what we need to understand is social media can be used as a tool to entertain us. It can be used as a tool to inform us. It can be used as a tool to mobilize us, but it won't just do that on its own. And so whatever it is that you're fighting for, if it's for a local election or a local policy, the people are there, like, accessible to us for us to inform and inspire and mobilize them. We actually have to do it. And what I find when I ask students those types of questions, sometimes I even ask students a more basic question to say, like, has anybody ever even asked you what are the problems that you care about in your community? And normally 99% of the students that I'm speaking with and polling will say, no, nobody has even asked me what is the issue that induces fear in me? What is the issue that breaks my heart right now? And so there are a lot of missed opportunities. And what I know is this: those who are fighting against the policies that we love and care about and fighting for policies that could do us harm, they are on social media right now, winning and wooing and swaying their followers. And we have to find smart ways to do that in our own way. And I think in a lot of ways we're losing those battles. I'll close with this. Often what we are asking people to do is way too simple. Sometimes our ask is just to vote. And now asking people to vote is better, I suppose, than nothing, but that's just not specific enough. Vote for who and why, vote for what and where. You know, it's it's not nearly enough to just say vote. And what happens is our political opponents actually find real issues to mobilize their base around, and we just default to vote. And it's often not enough. I want us to vote, but we have to do better and be way more specific than just saying vote.
Well, Shaun, this has been great. We have about a minute left, so let me end talking about the future. What's your next big project?
Well, I mentioned a little bit. Thank you for asking and giving me a chance to talk about it. I mentioned Philadelphia, and I see Philadelphia in a way that I see Los Angeles. It's a city completely controlled by Democrats. And I say that to say that it's a city where Democrats can't necessarily blame anyone else for the problems of that place politically. And what I'm hoping to do in Philadelphia is for us to really figure out what it means to address the crisis of gun violence, the crisis of homicides in Philadelphia. As I said earlier, last year was the deadliest year ever for Philly. Almost 95% of those gun violence victims were young Black men, 95%. And I really am trying to figure out how me and my network and others can put our heads together to begin solving that problem in a comprehensive way. It's not something we could do overnight. It's a project that would take us years, but we're starting to work on it now.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, Shaun King, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. It's been eye-opening and has left us all with a bit more to think about when considering these issues. I'm glad that you are also remaining to join our panel.
Thank you, man. It's my honor to be here.
Our honor as well. In fact, speaking of our panel, it's time to introduce the esteemed participants who have graciously spared their time to be with us in order to share their unique perspectives. Let's start with Crystal Crawford. She is the Executive Director for the Western Center on Law and Poverty, which advocates on behalf of Californians experiencing poverty in every branch of government, from the courts to the legislature. Welcome. Next, we have John Yang. He is the Executive Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, where he leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy, advocacy, education, and litigation. Greetings, Mr. Yang. We're also joined by Shakari Byerly, partner and principal researcher at Evitarus. There she conducts public opinion research encompassing a broad range of issues, including candidate and ballot measure campaigns, as well as public attitudes toward education and healthcare. Glad to have you with us, Ms. Byerly. And also participating today is Thomas A. Saenz. He is the president and general counsel for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also known as MALDEF, where he leads the organization's national efforts to promote civil rights for all Latinos living in the United States. And of course, rounding out our panel is author and activist that you just heard from, Shaun King. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us today for this special event. Our attendees can find out more about any of our panelists by checking out their extended biographies in the event program. And so now that everyone is set, I will jump right into it. The theme for this event is voting rights and redistricting. What's at stake? So I'm going to start by asking all of you, what's at stake? Ms. Crawford, as Executive Director of the Western Center for Law and Poverty, what is the link between legislation and poverty? And can we legislate our way into or out of poverty? Ms. Crawford.
Yes, so glad to be with you all. I am a CDU fan. I love Charles Drew University, so when you all asked me to be here, it was a no-brainer for me. So glad to be here. Legislation is one of the tools in our toolkit to be able to help dismantle oppression of all kinds. And so it is a tool that we need to use, and at Western Center we employ on a regular basis as we work to address racial and economic justice issues. I will say that, we specifically as an organization don't work on voting rights and redistricting, but in the spirit of Dr. King, we all need to be about building a movement that connects voting rights and economic justice, right? That was the whole Poor People's Campaign, the work that Reverend Barbara is doing now to continue that legacy, and so many others, is really about making that link between voting rights and economic justice, and of course racial justice, and legislation is one of the tools in our toolkit to really be able to help fight this battle. And we at Western Center try and use it on a regular basis. We're committed to doing so, and that's part of our legacy as an organization that works on both impact litigation as well as policy advocacy.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal Crawford. And let's turn now to John Yang. Mr. Yang, more than 11 million Asian Americans were eligible to vote in the 2020 election, making up almost 5% of the electorate, and represent the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the total pool of eligible U.S. voters. Has this community been targeted for voter suppression, and how?
Thank you very much for having me here. Absolutely, the Asian American community has been definitely targeted for voter suppression, just like all communities of color, just like all newer citizens here to the United States. And so what does this look like for the Asian American community? Some of the tactics that we see would include voter ID laws that require some type of match between a driver's license and other forms of identification. As we all know, any names that are not sort of westernized, such as a Nicholas Jones or a Karen Brown, oftentimes are misspelled by county clerks, by people at the DMV. If you think about Asian American names, that happens so frequently. And so if that is used as a basis for denying us the right to vote, then clearly there is something that's wrong there. Another tactic that's often used is mail-in balloting. Asian Americans have preferred the use of mail-in balloting. If you look at Georgia as an example, we had over 40% of our population vote through mail-in ballots compared to about 34% of the general population. Both for the runoff as well, Asian Americans oversampled when using mail-in ballots. So when you have tactics like Georgia that have restricted the number of drop boxes, restricted the amount of time that people could get and then turn in their absentee ballots, that has an effect on our community. And certainly another thing that we have seen is some type of proof of citizenship. The Asian American community is 60% immigrant, as in born in a foreign country. Over 90% of our population are either immigrant or children of immigrants. So anytime you require this additional form of identification, right, and recognizing that many of our community are naturalized, it imposes another burden and creates another tier of citizenship, if you will. So those are some of the things that we see. The other thing that we would see is just reductions in budget with respect to ballot access, with respect to languages. As we all have seen, there's a lot of new voter suppression laws that are being enacted. Not only are they being enacted, but there's not enough information being given out to all of our communities, and this includes the Asian American community, about these changes. It's no accident that about 1 in 8 absentee ballots were rejected in Texas during this primary season. The reason is because a lot of people didn't understand these changes. Now think about not understanding these changes and then also having a language barrier to that. So those are some of the things that we're looking at, that we're exceptionally concerned about, that's happening throughout the country, that is affecting our community, the Asian American community's right to vote.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Yang. Next is a question for Shakari Byerly. You are involved in public opinion research encompassing a broad range of issues. What is the public sentiment about the current efforts around redistricting?
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlisle, and it's just a pleasure to be among this esteemed panel. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, only 15% of U.S. adults say they have even heard about the redistricting process. That number jumps to just over a quarter for those who follow political news and current events. So that means that overall, more than 8 in 10 Americans, or 85%, have low levels of awareness and say they're unsure about whether the redistricting process has been a net positive or a net negative for their local area. Redistricting is a relatively esoteric issue, and most aren't aware of its impact and have a challenge seeing the direct connection between bread and butter issues like a lack of affordable housing, the cost of living, public education, health disparities, and justice inequity issues. That said, the public largely rejects the idea that public officials or elected officials should draw their own lines and effectively choose the voters that will support or reject their reelection. But when communities are activated and educated, they respond. Everything with redistricting is national, but its impact is local. So when you look at things nationally, there's a trend across the country at the congressional level, the city and county level, and increasingly at local school boards to impact the equity issues, the justice issues around redistricting. And we have seen voters more organize and mobilize, particularly among our Black, Brown, and AAPI communities, to make that connection between their representation and their ability to advocate on justice and equity issues as it relates to drawing of their district lines. So it's an issue that's critically important, and I think there is a huge role for us to play in the community organizing and civic engagement and justice communities to elevate this issues, not just once every 10 years, but to have an ongoing conversation with our communities about the importance of not only voting, but keeping the pulse on some of these electoral changes and the more esoteric parts of the process that do have real world impacts.
Great. Thank you, Shakari. Next up, we have Thomas Saenz. Mr. Saenz, what impact has redistricting had on Latino society in America, and what might happen if it remains unchecked?
Well, thank you, Dr. Carlisle, and thank you for inviting me to join this terrific panel. For the Latino community, redistricting going back many decades to at least 1981 has presented a tremendous opportunity to increase the political power of the Latino community. And that has occurred through the intervention of the Voting Rights Act, which mandates the creation of majority-minority districts where there are indications of past and continuing discrimination, and most important, where there is racially polarized voting. Racially polarized voting is simply an indication that different racial groups vote differently, have different preferences about candidates and issues. And certainly racially polarized voting has characterized the experience of the Latino community in California and across the country. So the opportunity to create majority Latino districts each decade through redistricting has created chances for the community to have greater representation in Congress, in state legislatures, and more, particularly here in California, on local bodies that are now running district elections. So school boards, community college district, boards of trustees, special districts, county boards of supervisors. So redistricting has meant an opportunity for the Latino community. However, when you are a growing community like the Latino community, your growth and the creation of new Latino majority districts is almost inherently viewed as a threat by those who are currently in power. Because if someone new gets elected, and someone currently in office is going to have to somehow give up their seat, whether that's by retirement, whether that's by not being reelected, or some other means, they're going to lose power. Whenever the growth of a minority community like the Latino community is viewed as a threat to those currently in power, that's when, too often, those in power use tools of voter suppression, of racial gerrymandering, of violations of the Voting Rights Act to try to deter and prevent growing minority groups from taking the power that their growing numbers would suggest. And I'll end by saying the opportunities for the Latino community in 2021 and 2022 are certainly as high as they have ever been in our history. We saw that despite a significant undercount, Latinos had one of the most significant undercounts according to the Census Bureau, Census Bureau still reported that 51% of our entire nation's population growth came from the Latino community. Even more important, in California, over 2/3 of our state's population growth came from the Latino community. Along with that, and surprising to some, over 2/3 of the growth of the citizen voting age population in California came from the Latino community. Citizen voting age population, an estimate provided on a rolling basis by the Census Bureau, is the best measure of potential voters. These are all those over 18 who are citizens and therefore presumptively eligible to vote. So this past decade has presented a new opportunity for the Latino community to achieve, through redistricting, more chances to elect candidates of choice who support and understand the issues of the Latino community. But we still face, as we now face, for example, in Texas, where MALDIF is already litigating against legislators who use their current power to preserve themselves in power by not only failing to create new Latino majority districts despite the growth of the Latino community in Texas, but even sought to dismantle existing Latino districts to prevent them from electing candidates supported by the Latino community. So redistricting has been a mixture of both opportunity and challenge, and that's certainly as true today as it ever has been.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for that excellent answer. And now we'll come back to Shaun King. Which elections matter most when talking about reforming the criminal justice system? Is reforming the system more of a local effort, or is this best addressed on a national and federal level?
That's a great question. I'll give the answer that I believe in the most, but then I'll tell you what we've learned as we've actually tried to practice this. In most American cities and counties, there's no single person that has a bigger impact on the legal and justice system than your local prosecutor, the district attorney, and other places may call it the state's attorney, as we see in Maryland and Illinois and other places. But your local district attorney has an enormous impact on who is charged, what they're charged with, and almost 90% of all incarcerated people come through the office of a local district attorney. There are 2,300 district attorneys around the country, but only about 150 district attorneys, 150 men and women, oversee over 50% of all incarcerated people. And so those 150 district attorneys in America's largest cities and counties, including Los Angeles and Houston, Atlanta and New York and other places, Chicago, those district attorneys have an enormous impact on everything from exonerations. And we've seen this in Philadelphia, where we've helped to elect the current district attorney, Larry Krasner, 2 times. Larry Krasner's office there, the Philadelphia district attorney's office, they have exonerated more people in his 5 years in office than the entire Innocence Project, the world's most well-known and respected organization on the issues of exonerations. So a district attorney's office can have just an enormous amount of leeway, influence, power, and impact. But what we have found in our 5 years of fighting to elect district attorneys, we've now elected district attorneys in 25 of America's largest cities. What we found is that they alone can't change the system by themselves. Your mayor matters. Your city council matters. Your state attorney general matters. The governor matters. The federal government, of course, matters. But I would say that in a city like Los Angeles, your local district attorney has a bigger impact on the Los Angeles justice system than the president of the United States, than the attorney general of the United States. Now, of course, the president and the attorney general matter in a major way, but most people are incarcerated on the local level. And so even when we see someone come into office who may have a huge heart to change issues of justice, there's only so much they can do on the federal level, particularly without a strong Senate majority, a strong congressional majority. And so I'm still encouraged because we have been able to see sweeping policy changes that can get implemented almost instantly from the 25 district attorneys that we've elected. But if a district attorney is elected but has an adversarial relationship with their mayor or their city council or their state attorney general or governor, all the changes that they introduce can be rolled back. And so the part of us being in this complicated democracy in America is that you don't just fight for change and expect to see it last forever. You have to fight for it and defend it. So there's so many positions that impact the system that I've tried to really begin teaching people that one of the reasons we fight so hard for change on issues of justice, issues of mass incarceration and policing, but don't see the change that we want to see, is this is a massive system. It's incredibly complex, and you can really only change it city by city, county by county, district by district. And we forget the United States is one of the largest countries in the world, both geographically and population wise. And so our problems are sophisticated problems, and we have to fight back with really sophisticated solutions as well.
Great, great. Shaun, thank you very much. We'll go on. I'm going to ask a general question first, and rather than asking panelists to respond, when I direct a question to you individually, think about how you might want to respond to that individual question in the context of the overall question about redistricting. So we all know that redistricting is often framed as an underhanded partisan tool used by both sides of the political spectrum. Indeed, everyone has participated in it for history. How do we fix the system to do what it was intended to do, to be representative truly, and not to be a tool for undue partisan influence? So with that in mind, let's go back to Crystal Crawford. Ms. Crawford, COVID provided an opportunity to rethink voting accessibility, leading to the experiment that was the 2020 election. Did it work? What can we learn from it?
Well, I would say that the whole underlying point around power and the connection between power and voting, we learned that the more we expand access to folks and encourage more folks to exercise their power, the more we are going to be attacked, and the oppressive tools of the master are going to come into play to try and exclude folks. Dolores Huerta has a quote that I love that says, "Power is like love. The more you share it, the more it grows," right? So in 2020, we saw that sharing of power with, having to use other tools, mail-in voting, all the other ways that we were able to get folks engaged and have a, just historic turnout amongst folks across this country that were low income, as well as low wealth folks and communities of color. So it was exciting to see, I think, the increased turnout and increased fervor that folks had around voting, but that also meant that we saw increased attacks and the situation that we're dealing with now in this country with the retrenchment of voting rights and the use of redistricting to really, decrease the power of folks that we are trying to disenfranchise. So one last piece in terms of answering this question that I have to lift up is I was born in October of 1965, telling my age. And so just a couple months after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. And so, when we think about how youthful I look and that I'm the first generation of people in my family to be born with the right to vote, that first couple months right after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. So I think, the fact that we have to look at the fact that I've heard someone say recently too, that Black people have faced barriers to voting longer than we have had the right to vote. And I've heard that, and I was like, wow, that is deeply profound. And so yes, 2020 gave us the opportunity to get more folks energized around voting, and out and about and engaged. But I think putting it in the context of the short history of how long, particularly Black folks, have had the absolute right to vote in this country, and the long strides that we need to take to really share that power in the spirit of Dolores Huerta's words about power being like love, and that we need to share it and it needs to grow. So we need more folks to be engaged in voting rights advocacy so that that power can continue to grow.
And to be sure, it's like a simple principle of physics in the political or policy context. The faster you go, the more resistance you face. And the challenge is overcoming that resistance, indeed. Let's go back to John Yang. Mr. Yang, what role does an organization like yours play in helping ensure that all populations are represented fairly in each election cycle? What steps are to be taken to make sure Asian American voices are heard in the next election?
Yeah, so I really appreciate what we're saying about power, right? Because first, in terms of redistricting, what we're talking about is there are those that want to either retain power or create power for themselves. And when we talk about redistricting, we really should be talking about how do we reflect the power of the community that already exists there, right? And so if you think about that as the core of what we're trying to achieve, that helps us to visualize that goal. In terms of where AAJC fits into all of this is, again, for our community, typically we face barriers with respect to language. We face barriers with respect to the understanding, being newer immigrants here. And we face barriers in terms of racial discrimination that all of us face. So what we do is educate our community, both educate our community about whether it's redistricting, whether it's voting. We operate a hotline, 888-APIA-VOTE, so that if people have questions about how to vote, they could call our hotline. And that hotline is operated in multiple Asian languages. We will educate people about, election officials about what their obligations are in providing language assistance in sort of how they conduct the polls. So those are all the things that we can do. And then what I would ask all of us to do, right, is think about being a volunteer as a poll monitor at your local district level. Think about going back to what Shaun was saying about doing more than just voting. Is thinking about what else you can do. Being a volunteer, making sure that your friends are educated and that they will vote. Making sure that your parents, your kids, to the extent they're first-time voters, have a plan as to how they will vote, exercise their right to vote. Because if we really educate ourselves and make sure that those around us are educated, then we start to get to a better space. And then the last thing we do, and oftentimes we do this in partnership with Tom at MALDEF, is we litigate to the extent that we see issues at the ballot box, issues with respect to some of the really horrific laws that we're seeing. We will file a lawsuit.
Great. Thank you so much. Shakari Byerly, in your research, what are the biggest misconceptions the public has about redistricting and voting rights, and where do these misconceptions come from?
Thank you so much for that question. I think the largest misconception is one of the things you opened with, the fact that there's a misconception that redistricting is only about partisan politics. It's only about an insider conversation, a process that everyday people can't understand. And nothing could be farther from the truth. One of the things we found in California is that we've seen remarkably higher levels of public engagement in the process of redistricting with the implementation of independent citizen redistricting in California, both at the state level for congressional districts and increasingly at the local level. Why is that? I think a large part of that is because it gives community an opportunity to, as John said, build power, to define and to recognize for themselves what they consider to be community and the places and spaces that constitute those communities of interest. But we also have to think about equity as we implement these plans, particularly for populations that have historically been marginalized and disproportionately impacted. Our voting systems in our districts are majoritarian. They're not proportional. And so it privileges oftentimes numbers over equity. This is particularly important for Black Californians who represent only 6% of the population. And that percentage has been declining largely because of a lack of equity. Black people are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. In LA County, we're 7% of the population, but 40% of those that are unhoused. Mass incarceration. Many of our prison systems, though the population goes to the districts, or the power goes to the districts where our prisons are located, not where people are returning to. And so how do we get representation for the communities, our indigenous communities, our Black communities, our Southeast Asian communities that are lower proportions but still deserve a voice? California doesn't have the legal presence of the NAACP LDF. And so while we have big fights in Georgia, in Texas, in North Carolina, we also have big fights here in California, particularly for populations that are under-resourced. So equity has to be at the center of any process or systems change.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Byerly. Thomas Saenz, what legal recourse exists for the electorally disenfranchised?
That's the great challenge of this work, is that you can't redo an election. So once an election has gone by, if somebody has been prevented by nefarious means from voting, you can't reintroduce their vote. So it's critically important, as your question suggests, that every voter be armed with a knowledge of what it is they can do. In the state of California, every voter should go with the right to insist on at least casting a provisional ballot. So that gives time after the election to resolve any questions that may be raised about that person's right to vote. You at least have the vote there in an envelope ready to be counted once those issues are resolved. It's important that every voter have that knowledge. But then it's all about community action. We have to collectively demand the focus on changing our voting to better reflect what we've learned over the years since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when it was enacted. We have learned more and more about redistricting, about the partisan role in redistricting that you alluded to. We've learned more about how those who are currently in power, not just individuals, but groups, react to threats posed by growing populations, how they react to coalitions of people of color. And it's not a happy story. So we have to put our laws in place, modernize them, to address what we see occurring. At the very beginning of this program, the incomparable Sylvia Drew-Ivey talked about the current Supreme Court, and she was alluding to a case in 2013 where the court, by a 5-4 vote, took away what I think had been accurately characterized as the most powerful tool in civil rights law in our country, and that was a pre-clearance regime that required certain jurisdictions to take every electoral change and submit it for pre-review before it could be implemented by the Department of Justice, or at the jurisdiction's option, a 3-judge court in Washington, D.C. And the court majority in that case decided that the coverage formula, which by the way included portions of California, was outdated and could no longer be used. Now that presented an opportunity that my friend John alluded to earlier, and that is in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a chance to enact a new coverage formula. And we have taken that chance to create 2 coverage formulas. One that responds to the jurisdictions that have long histories, many of them in the South, of discriminating against voters of color. Those should still be subject to preclearance. But we've added something new that would focus on some of the rapidly changing communities in the Southwest and the western part of the United States, where they see growing populations of minority voters, and the immediate reaction of those in power is to say, stop, let's stop this from going on and deter and prevent these new growing groups from voting. So we've put in place into that legislation something called known practices coverage, which, as it suggests, it identifies the voting discriminatory practices used going back decades and decades and decades, and says no matter where you are, you cannot use those tools to disenfranchise growing groups of minority voters. That's about modernizing our Voting Rights Act to reflect what we have learned in the interim. But we've got to collectively get our Congress to move forward on that. We have moved from a time when the last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act early in this century had bipartisan supermajorities in both houses of Congress, where today we can't get Republicans to move it forward at all, to permit it to move forward in the United States Senate. So we've got to work collectively to demand a modernization of our civil rights laws to address what we've learned in now over 50 years of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, thank you, Mr. Saenz. Let's go on and wrap up our panelist questions before going to audience questions with one last question for Shaun King. What have you learned from your efforts to move the needle that might encourage others who are also trying to make a difference?
Well, that's a great question. There are probably two quick lessons that I'll share, and I'm looking forward to us answering some of the questions from the audience. One is you can have an enormous impact on local politics. And I say that as not just as somebody who does have the following that I do, but I've seen people with very few followers on social media throw their heart and soul and time and attention into a local policy that they want to change, a local election they want to be a part of. And I have seen those individuals, women and men and people from all different types of backgrounds, make a huge impact on their school board, on their city council, on local ordinances. Sometimes we get so overwhelmed by the sheer volume and magnitude of our problems that we forget that when we throw ourselves into a local battle, a local fight, a local struggle, that we can see the fruits of our labor. And that's encouraged me tremendously to be able to throw my heart and soul into a local race or a local policy that matters and see that race won, that policy changed. Our organization has now helped win nearly 100 elections across the country. We've had policy victories in 10 different states that we're proud of, but it all started with local people really pouring their heart and soul into what it is they want to change. And so it's easy to be overwhelmed when you look at the entire nation. I would really encourage people who see this now or later to just really plug in locally to see how you can impact your school, your job, your employer, your neighborhood, your community, your district. And even sometimes the work we do is block by block, not even neighborhood by neighborhood, but you can have an impact on the block that you live on. And I want to encourage people to start small, to start locally and grow from there.
Well, thank you, as always, Mr. King, for that great response. Let's move to some audience questions now. And one that's just come up actually kind of, again, brings things full circle back to the healthcare context. In our community, healthcare practitioners, physicians, nurses, others are often the trusted messengers. Do you have any recommendations, and this is for all of you, it's kind of a free-for-all, do you have any recommendations for our healthcare professionals at here at Charles R. J. University and elsewhere, and how to support this and other courses given their very limited time with patients? How can healthcare professionals be activists in this area? Thomas.
So I think that because they are such trusted messengers, we really have to break down this notion that our doctors should only be talking to patients about healthcare related matters, their own individual healthcare. And there are lots of organizations and healthcare providers who have begun to break that down by getting their physicians and nurses and others to talk about voting, to talk about registering to vote, to talk about being counted in the census, to talk about the issues that are coming up in the midterm election. You don't have to do that from a partisan standpoint, so you won't get in trouble from that perspective, but you can emphasize to folks the connection between their own family's health and participating in elections, participating actively in policy formation. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. And it's a really important role given the trust that so many of us have in our doctors.
Let's go on to other panelists who might want to answer that question as well. Thank you. Crystal
I'll
Crawford.
chime in just to say, putting on my community organizer and health advocate hat, using the waiting room and other spaces that you have available to you that people are spending a lot of time in to put key messages around activism up, whether it's pamphlets you have available on your counters or other places, messaging that people are absorbing and taking away with them, in addition to hearing what you're saying to them in the spirit of what Thomas was saying, but actually just creating activism central in the spaces that you are seeing patients and talking to them. It really does stick with folks when people see those visual messages and imagery.
Great. Thank you. Let's go on to another question from the audience. So we've got about maybe a little bit less than 5 minutes left before we go on to our wrap up. This one comes from Stephen T. And it's actually a profound question, so I'm glad that we're ending on it. It seems redistricting often results in the silencing of minority voices and votes. Is the concept of proportional representation outdated? Who wants to answer that question?
I can take a start. Thank you so much for the question. As I mentioned, majoritarian systems aren't meant to elevate and build power for minority populations. And so I think it's a very fresh and relevant idea to talk about proportional representation systems. We see that other countries have those systems and are able to create spaces for more voices around the table directly from communities and from people. The challenge is that our American system, however, does not do transformation very well. We have a process that is designed for incremental change. So I think the question is, how do we build power within our local communities to stand up and to fight for transformational change in those types of solutions that will give a broader voice?
Great. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Saenz.
So I think it's a terrific question, but I do think we have to start from understanding that we don't actually follow proportional representation principles in so many of our systems. And so many of those systems are what become problematic. The Electoral College is not a proportional representation system because it is weighted towards smaller, less populated states. And it is weighted that way because of the United States Senate, which itself is not a tool of proportional representation. I mentioned that because, as I said, what's blocking the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is the United States Senate. So it's not actually a reflection of the views of the majority of people or voters in this country. It's the view of a minority of senators who represent smaller populated states. So I think we really have to approach these questions by recognizing that we do have exceptions to a notion of proportional representation, and they're increasingly problematic. We have had now in this century 2 presidents who were elected without the plurality of popular votes. That's George W. Bush and Donald Trump. That's twice in a century that's only 22 years old. We've got to start looking back at some of these ancestral vehicles that present problems in our modern society. I note that these proportional representation violations, if you will, are not designed to represent the people. If you view the people as those who are the large group of us who may not have power, may not have wealth, they're actually designed to embed power with the status quo. And that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for pointing that out. John Yang, Shaun King, did you want to comment as well before we wrap up here? Okay, Shaun? Okay.
No, the comments that were given were incredibly thoughtful. Just to say that I even struggle to think of almost anywhere where we see true proportional representation in this country. As I just listened to my fellow panelists, I think the creative, the question was, is it outdated? I do think the ways we pursue equity and think of equity and equality are often outdated. How we implement these things, we I think this entire space deserves fresh, creative thinking. And so I I don't know the original question's intent, but yes, there is a ton of room for innovation in how we do this. But to the point, we hardly see equitable representation anywhere, and including in our most important bodies across the country. And so when we do see it, it's a beautiful thing. Just to celebrate New York City, um, this current city council that we just inaugurated was the first city council to have a majority of women in the history of New York. And that actually represents the demographics of New York City. And so, but that doesn't look anything like the United States Senate or the United States Congress or most American boardrooms or C-suites. So there's a lot of space for growth when we think about proportional representation.
Wow. Wow. Well, let me say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for bringing this issue full circle. Thank you for bringing it to our particular audience, our community at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, where our mission statement includes the phrases social justice and health equity. And yes, even for healthcare professionals, these are important and critical issues. And thank you to our panel of experts for really bringing this home and really challenging us to think as health professionals of how we can become more active in this arena. So again, thank you very much to all of our esteemed panelists. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're left, of course, with much to consider and think about as well. And I feel that this has been a really, really informative experience. I want to thank our special featured guest, Shaun King. A heartfelt thank you as well to the rest of our panel, John Yang, Crystal Crawford, Shakari Byerly, and Thomas Saenz. And before closing out, I want to thank our many sponsors for this event. While the President's Breakfast is a meaningful forum for the exchange of critical ideas, it also serves as an opportunity to fundraise in support of CDU's vision of achieving excellent health and wellness for all in a world without health disparities. So thank you to our platinum sponsors, Torrey Pines Bank and Sylvia Drew Ivy, our gold sponsors, Blue Shield California, Promise Health Plans, Altamed, Martin Luther King Community Hospital. We're equally appreciative of our many bronze, silver, and individual VIP sponsors. And finally, a tip of the hat to the many people who have worked behind the scenes and those who are doing so right now to bring this event to fruition. If you're looking for more engaging conversation, the CDU Community Forum, a free monthly virtual event hosted by Sylvia Drew Ivy, takes place today at 2 p.m. Check the event calendar at our website, cdrewu.edu, for a link to attend. We also hope to see you next year at the 8th Annual President's Breakfast. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much, and see you again soon.